The sun was just cresting the horizon, spilling molten gold across the rippling wheat fields of Russell, Kansas. The tall stalks leaned gently in the morning breeze, their heads heavy with promise and grain stretching in every direction until they melted into a sky that blushed with dawn. It was here on the wooden porch of a small white-clapboard house that Ruthie Mae Holloway first realized how small her world felt and how vast it might yet become. Born weather-vane straight on a dusty farm road, Ruthie's childhood was measured by the seasons, planting in the spring, harvesting in the summer, and hunkering down through harsh winters. Every year she woke before sunrise to help her parents feed the livestock, churn butter, and mend broken fences. Those fields taught her endurance. When the wind howled, you bent your back. When the rain drowned the crops, you prayed and tried again. Yet as sturdy as her roots, she felt a restlessness stirring within, a quiet hum that asked, "What else is out there?" In the summers of her teenage years, local factory recruiters would roll into town, their vans plastered with glossy posters promising good wages and steady hours. To Ruthie's father, those recruiters were charlatans. "No decent woman leaves her home for a factory," he'd grumble. But to a 17-year-old girl who watched her fiancé Jimmy head off to basic training, the promise of paychecks beyond farmhand pennies felt like a door cracking open. When Jimmy never returned, another young life claimed by the jungles of Vietnam, Ruthie's grief became resolve. She would not wait for someone else's chapter, she would write her own. By 1972, the world around her was changing. The Equal Employment Opportunity Act had just come into force, promising to shatter some of the glass ceilings that had kept women confined to secretarial desks or classroom front rows. In theory, it meant doors were supposed to be open. In reality, many of those doors, especially in the humming heart of American manufacturing, remained bolted tight by prejudice and old guard minds. But for the first time, there was at least a legal crack in the wall, and Ruthie stared into it with fierce anticipation. When she finally stepped off the bus in Wichita at 19, the city's noise startled her horns, honking in traffic, the clank and hiss of factory machinery, and the endless hum of fluorescent lights. She found work on the sewing line at H. Heartland Textiles, 9 cents a shirt, piece rate pay, and a rulebook longer than the Mississippi. Mrs. Finch's boarding house, where she lived with 2 other girls, had its own rigid schedule: lights out at 8:30, sharp chapel attendance mandatory on Sundays, and not so much as a glimpse of male company beyond the gravel road outside. Those early months were a crucible. The air always smelled of oil and raw fabric, like metal and earth in collision. Ruthie's hands, once smooth from milking cows and breaking horses, grew calloused and scarred, the pricks of needles a permanent constellation across her fingertips. She scrubbed in communal washrooms until her skin shone but still clung the factory dust. Nights her muscles ached with the steady repetition of machine-guided stitches. She often lay awake listening to the distant drone of the generators, wondering if she had made a terrible mistake, until the memory of Jimmy's last letter steeled her resolve. Yet even as her body protested, her mind was waking. On breaks, she'd lean against a cool metal pillar and listen to seasoned operators argue over fabric weights and seam tolerances. One evening after the shift ended, she tracked down Mr. Jenkins, the oldest floor manager, and peppered him with questions. "Why is this seam puckering? How do you adjust the feed dogs to prevent skipped stitches?" He watched her for a moment, brow furrowed, then said, "Holloway, you've got a better eye for flaws than half the boys on this floor." In those 6 words, she heard opportunity knocking. It was a small thing, but in a world where small moments carry the weight of revolutions, it was everything. With Mr. Jenkins' quiet encouragement, she applied for an assistant supervisor role when it opened. At the time, she'd have paid good money for someone to tell her it would all work out. Instead, She faced skepticism from every corner. Her father's silence, Susan Parker's laughter at lunch, and the subtle, almost invisible barrier that no woman could truly lead men in overalls. But Ruthie had learned a lesson early on: when life gives you little victories, you stack them one atop the other until they form an unbreakable tower. Her application went into corporate's inbox in Chicago beside a memo mentioning the new EEOC requirements. When her name emerged on the promotion list, it was dressed up in PR, flourish, heartland, textiles embraces opportunity, but tagged with a warning from Mr. Hargrove, the factory director: one misstep, and the experiment would be over. Still, she said yes. She'd taken enough risks to know that fear is a compass pointing toward growth. The day she donned her crisp yellow badge, reading Supervisor, her heart pounded like a barn dance drum, equal parts terror and triumph. For the first time, she stepped beyond the clatter of the sewing machines into an office that smelled of fresh paint and opportunity. Looking back from her porch decades later, Ruthie chuckles at how small those fears seem now. She watches the prairie grass sway and thinks of that 19-year-old determined to carve a path far beyond the Kansas horizon. What she didn't know then was how many battles lay ahead, how a new superior would test her every day, how resilience could be forged in humiliation, and how a simple spiral notebook would become her greatest weapon. But those lessons belong to the next chapter of her story. Right now, in this golden morning light, she simply smiles at the fields that raised her, grateful for every blade of grass, every stitch broken and mended, every law passed, and prejudice challenged. And as she leans back in her rocker, she wonders how many of us have stood at our own figurative porch, watching the wind stir our possibilities, but hesitated to step forward. Soon we'll dive into those first trials, when ambition met obstruction, and when a farmer's daughter learned to fight smarter, not just harder. The factory floor was a world unto itself, a churning sea of machines and motion, where the rhythm of life was measured in stitches per minute and bolts per shift. When Ruthie Mae Holloway stepped onto that humming expanse each morning, she entered a place that demanded her full attention and then some. Imagine standing at a long row of sewing machines, each one a mechanical promise of productivity, its needle flashing up and down like a metronome set to breakneck pace. The air smelled of hot metal oil and cotton dust, an arcane perfume that clung to your hair, your clothes, even your thoughts. A typical day began before the sun hit its stride. Ruthie would slip into her coveralls, tie the ribbons of her hair back tight, and clock in at exactly 700 a.m. The floor supervisor's whistle would blow at 7:05, and the machines would roar to life. For the next 12 hours, she'd lean over her station, guiding yards of fabric through the jaws of a Singer industrial sewing machine, her feet tapping out a steady cadence on the pedal. Lunch was a hurried 30 minutes spent on a bench in the break room, trading sandwich crusts for factory gossip. Did you hear about the new quota? Or they're talking layoffs next month. Breaks were rare respites. By the time they came, Ruthie's fingers were stiff with repetition, her back sore from leaning forward under the harsh fluorescent lights. By comparison, many of today's distribution center workers face similar strains, standing on concrete floors for hours, scanning packages in climate-controlled warehouses that hum with conveyor belts. Yet whereas modern roles might rotate tasks, offer ergonomic supports, or grant mobile water breaks, Ruthie's world in the early 1970s offered none of those luxuries. Every motion was repetitive, every minute tied to a piece rate that rewarded speed over comfort. And if your output dipped, you felt it in the pit of your stomach like a silent rebuke that threatened your paycheck. Yet beneath the physical grind, something else was stirring ambition. From her first day, Ruthie asked herself, "Why can't I learn everything about this operation?" She kept a small notepad tucked in her pocket, jotting down terms she overheard: bias tape, pattern, alignment, feed, dog tension. At break one morning, she cornered Mr. Jenkins, the grizzled floor manager, whose salt and pepper moustache was almost as legendary as his knowledge of fabric floors. "Sir," she began, "I noticed these collars tend to flare when the seam allowance is too wide. Is there an adjustment on the machine to prevent it?" He paused, his forehead creasing like well-worn leather. No one had ever asked him a question quite like that. "Holloway," he said finally, using her last name as both salutation and brand. "You're the first person I've met on this floor who sees fabric the way I see it. Come by my office after your shift, and I'll show you how to recalibrate the feed dogs." In that moment, mentorship found Ruthie quiet, unassuming, and wrapped in the scent of machine oil. Over the next several weeks, she spent her evenings at Jenkins's office desk, learning to read blueprints of sewing patterns and memorize the parts of the machine that no manual ever bothered to explain. She discovered that Jenkins had started as an operator himself back in the late 1940s and had risen through patience and curiosity. He taught her not only the how of quality control, but the why. Why? A customer would reject a seam that puckered why fabric tension could make or break an order's profitability. More importantly, he taught her how to listen to the hum of the motor, to the whispers of her co-workers, to the subtle signs that a machine was about to jam. At the same time, another mentor emerged, Mr. Donovan, the Assistant Director of Operations, who'd come in from the Springfield plant to oversee the Kansas facility. Donovan had a different style firm, but fair, with a fondness for bullet point memos and spreadsheet printouts. He noticed that Ruthie's name kept turning up in reports as someone who asked good questions and followed through on her curiosity. One afternoon, he called her into his glassed-in office and slid a neatly typed memo across the desk. It read, "To Ruthie May Holloway, from E.R.D. Donovan, subject leadership potential. Consider volunteering to train new hires next week." For Ruthie, that memo was a revelation. She had seen workplace sponsorship happen naturally under Mr. Jenkins's wing, but Donovan's gesture was a reminder that upward mobility often requires an outside push, a sponsor willing to put your name forward. She threw herself into training the new hires, teaching them machine basics and quality standards. She learned to hold her ground when they asked for shortcuts, and to model consistency when customers demanded perfection. By teaching, she internalized principles of leadership, clarity, patience, and the courage to say no when the job required it. Of course, self-promotion can feel awkward, especially in a tight-knit factory where humility is prized. Ruthie remembers the afternoon she nervously approached Donovan, voice quivering, to ask if her training sessions had helped. Many shy away from that question, fearing it sounds like bragging. But Donovan's eyes lit up. "Ruthie, it's exactly how I know you're ready for more responsibility," he said. "Keep me posted on what you need, and I'll keep talking to Hargrove about your progress." From that moment, she understood a vital lesson: asking for feedback isn't vanity, it's the currency of growth. Yet even as these mentors opened doors, the path upward was littered with resistance. On the production floor, whispers followed her everywhere. "There goes the girl who thinks she's a boss." Co-workers tested her patience, unloading their frustrations about quotas or faulty machines onto her fresh ears. A few male supervisors, threatened by her steady rise, would offer backhanded advice. "Don't get too big for your britches, Holloway. You're still one of us." Each barb felt like a reminder that many minds were still anchored in old prejudices. But Ruthie persisted, stacking small victories like bricks in a wall that would become unshakable. When her department met quota for the first time under her informal guidance 3 weeks before the deadline, she didn't broadcast the success. Instead, she quietly compiled the numbers, charted them against production studies, and shared them with Donovan in a concise memo. March 14th. April 3, 5% increase in on-time orders. Reject rate down 2%. He forwarded it to Hargrove with a one-line note. Impressive work by Miss Holloway. That one line served as both acknowledgement and armor against naysayers. By late 1973, Ruthie was not just another operator. She was a rising star seen by the right people. She had mentors who believed in her, a track record of measurable improvements, and the courage to advocate for herself, even when her voice trembled. She learned to frame her accomplishments not as personal triumphs, but as benefits to the company's bottom line. Faster turnarounds, fewer customer complaints, and a more motivated team. Still, the greatest lesson of all was understanding that ambition in a male-dominated world means two things working twice as hard and offering twice as much value. Ruthie never asked for leniency. She asked for opportunity. She never demanded special treatment. She demonstrated that her leadership, rooted in curiosity, collaboration, and unflinching consistency, could drive productivity forward. As you stand at the crossroads of your own career, whether you're in a warehouse, an office cubicle, or a remote home office, ask yourself, who are your Jenkins and your Donovan? Who will teach you the unseen mechanics of your industry? And who will vouch for you when you're not in the room? And are you stacking those small victories into a tower that resilience can't topple? The day Ruthie Mae Holloway stepped into her first management meeting as assistant supervisor, she carried with her a quiet confidence and a heavy awareness that not everyone in that room wanted her there. It was as though she'd opened the door to a long-dormant hornet's nest. The buzzing began immediately in subtle jabs, rather than outright assault. Over the months that followed, Ruthie would come to recognize these behaviors as the anatomy of undermining a systematic campaign designed to erode her authority, isolate her from her team, and make her question every decision. It began with logistics. One morning, Ruthie discovered that her production schedule, the one she'd spent hours perfecting, had been quietly altered. Machines were reassigned to other lines without her being told. Breaks that had been communicated on Friday disappeared from Monday's roster. When she asked the floor clerks, they shrugged. Must have been an update from upstairs. But no record of that update existed. In modern workplaces, these are the email black holes calendar events. Move without notification meeting invites vanish, and access to shared drives inexplicably evaporates. The result is the same confusion, lost time, and a creeping doubt that you really do understand your own job. Next came the memos. Important communications meant for Ruthie's department maintenance requests, client feedback process changes, never reached her desk. Instead, they sat unopened in an inbox she couldn't access, or fluttered into her personal mailbox 2 weeks late. It was akin to the phantom denial emails of today, where critical instructions are buried beneath marketing newsletters, or where auto-forward rules redirect messages away from the intended recipient. When the machinery failed, or the client complained, the finger pointed squarely at her. Perhaps the cruelest move was the disappearing chair. Picture this. Ruthie enters the weekly leadership roundtable, a room of folding chairs and oval tables, to find no seat reserved for her. She is forced to tug a chair from the supply closet, drawing the amused glances of longtime supervisors who've been watching the experiment of a woman in management with thinly veiled glee. Today's equivalent might be the empty seat at the boardroom table. No webcam feed for remote participants, no shared screen access. Subtle messages that you're not truly part of the team. In each instance, the tactic had a twofold effect. It undermined Ruthie's ability to lead, and it signaled to her colleagues that she was expendable. Those who might otherwise have supported her hesitated, unsure whether to speak up. The men who ran the operation whispered warning things. Don't get too comfortable. A reminder that her place was still under scrutiny. What drives someone to sabotage another's success? Psychologists point to a fear of power redistribution. When entrenched leaders see a newcomer, especially a woman, rise, they worry about their own turf. They wield their authority in covert ways, rerouting information, shifting deadlines, even inventing quality issues to call you out in front of clients. Rollins, the production manager, excelled at this. He'd stroll the floor brandishing a clipboard, feigning concern over supposed defects that had never failed Ruthie's exacting standards. Each loud announcement, "These scenes are unacceptable," was a performance meant to sow doubt among the workforce. Yet amid the sabotage, glimmers of solidarity emerged. Ruthie's team, seasoned women who'd weathered decades of factory life, understood the stakes. Martha, the veteran seamstress, would slip scraps of notebooks into Ruthie's purse, cryptic reminders that someone had her back. Doreen, a nimble 20-year-old, quietly stayed late when repairs dragged on, ensuring production kept pace. These small gestures echoed a timeless truth: in hostile environments, alliances are forged in quiet corners rather than boardroom spotlights. Building that inner circle was essential. Ruthie learned that even the smallest act of support could tip the balance. She began holding off-the-record chats with trusted colleagues during break times, using code words to avoid eavesdroppers. "How's Project Bluebird" meant, "Did you see the schedule switch?" Sometimes they met in the women's restroom, the one enclave the men rarely entered, to exchange observations. And radar out new incidents. Today, employees facing digital sabotage might use encrypted chat groups or private social channels to share evidence without triggering email filters. One afternoon, Ruthie cornered Gladys from accounting by the water cooler. Gladys, a stern woman in her 50s with a near mythical record of accuracy, confirmed that the timesheets for Ruthie's department were being intentionally manipulated. "They're padding the breaks and misreporting overtime," she whispered. Armed with that confirmation, Ruthie logged the incident in her spiral notebook. Date, time, witness, discrepancy. A few days later, Richard from maintenance admitted that Rollins had directed him to prioritize other departments' repairs over hers. Helen from HR acknowledged that applications for open roles under Ruthie's supervision vanished en route to her desk. With each new piece of evidence, Ruthie's network grew. She called it her circle of trust, a handful of co-workers who could verify events and bolster her credibility when the time came to confront management. This strategy mirrors modern best practices for whistleblowers. Document everything, find witnesses, and store copies off-site, online, or in physical safes. A 2019 Glassdoor study found that employees who formed support networks were 58% more likely to report unethical behavior successfully. Ruthie's experience decades earlier was already proving that theory. Even so, the campaign against her intensified. Rollins's tactics evolved from passive-aggressive to overt. He planted a dead mouse in her desk drawer, an unmistakable threat echoing old gangster tricks meant to terrify. He orchestrated a week-long heatwave by stalling AC repairs, leaving her team sweltering and production stalling. In today's terms, it's the economic equivalent of withholding critical resources, blocking access to software licenses, freezing expense reimbursements, or delaying hiring approvals until frustration forces a resignation. Each action is designed to break your spirit, reminding you that your standing depends on factors outside your control. Yet Ruthie never let those tactics go unanswered in despair. Instead, she channeled their cruelty into fuel for her determination. For every missing memo, she created her own. When the chairs disappeared, she purchased a sturdy folding stool and brought it to every meeting, signaling that she refused to be shunted aside. For the sabotaged schedules, she began printing color-coded calendars and posting them on departmental bulletin boards visible to all, impossible to misplace. Her most powerful response, however, was a quiet one: she refused to be isolated. Over lunch, she engaged with her team, asking for feedback and reinforcing her commitment to their success. When someone confided that they feared speaking out, she reminded them of Martha's cookies or Doreen's overnight shifts. Small acts of courage that mattered. She hosted informal gatherings after hours, rotating locations between the boarding house and a local diner, building camaraderie that transcended factory lines. In a modern context that might look like monthly team lunches, anonymous feedback surveys, or virtual coffee chats for remote employees. Tools that knit employees together against divisive tactics. By mapping Rollins's sabotage to contemporary equivalents, lost emails, revoked access, resource withholding, we see how timeless these tactics are and how crucial solidarity remains. The psychology is the same: undermine the individual, fracture the team, and maintain the status quo. But as Ruthie discovered, solidarity and persistence can counterbalance even the most insidious schemes. In hindsight, those trials were a masterclass in resilience. Ruthie learned to recognize early warning signs, the swift schedule changes, the missing communications, the behind-the-scenes maneuvers. She documented every slip, every snub, and every sabotage attempt, knowing that only a careful record could turn whispers into undeniable proof. She built alliances among the women on the floor, the fatigue-weary accountants, and the principled maintenance crew, her inner circle, who shared her vision of fairness. And she transformed each act of hostility into an opportunity for leadership. When the AC failed, she organized rotating brakes and improvised cooling fans. When machines broke, she coordinated with maintenance and sourced temporary workstations to keep production moving. So what can we learn from Ruthie's experience in the early 1970s, an age before email, Slack channels, or HR portals? First, stay vigilant for subtle signs of undermining. Second, don't try to fight in isolation. Third, build your own evidence-based document, dates, names, and specifics. Finally, cultivate an inner circle of trusted co-workers who can witness and verify your observations, creating a network of support that is stronger than any single act of sabotage. As Ruthie's journey continued, these skills would prove indispensable when she faced her greatest opponent yet in Vernon Rollins. But for now, she stood firm, buoyed by the knowledge that no matter how deeply someone attempted to isolate her, she was never truly alone, and that together, small acts of solidarity could build an unbreakable fortress against the fiercest opposition. That evening, after the factory's lights dimmed and the last sewing machine fell silent, Ruthie Mae Holloway sat at her kitchen table beneath a single bulb, a fresh spiral notebook open before her. The margins were pristine, the blue lines waiting to bear witness. In that moment, she understood that her greatest weapon against Vernon Rollins's relentless sabotage would not be anger or tears, but documentation. She had already weathered missing memos, altered schedules, and vanishing chairs, and each time she felt her authority chip away. But they could not erase evidence she herself created. So she bought that unassuming spiral-bound pad with her own lunch money, tucked it into her purse, and began writing. On the first page, dated October 3rd, 1974, she recorded Rollins told shipping to delay Macy's rush order by 2 days. Claimed I requested extension. Witnesses, Jim shipping, Carol billing. That single entry was more than a note. It was a declaration of intent. Night after night, she wrote down every slight, the exact words spoken, the names of co-workers who saw it happen, and any documents that corroborated her memory. When memos arrived weeks late, she stapled them between pages. When production quotas mysteriously jumped by 15%, she saved the bulletin board printouts yellowed with age. Each defect falsely attributed to her department earned a clipped report. Rollins's handwritten notes on QC checklists became pressed flowers between notebook leaves. In today's workplaces, you might use encrypted apps or secure cloud folders to log incidents. You might screenshot disappearing calendar invites or keep copies of altered spreadsheets in a hidden directory. But the principle is timeless. If you want to stand your ground, you must build a record no one can rewrite. By late October, Ruthie's spiral notebook was half full. She numbered pages, added an index at the front, and even used color-coded sticky tabs to flag critical incidents. Blue tabs marked safety issues, red tabs flagged client impact episodes, green tabs stored HR-related anomalies. At first, it felt obsessive. She wondered if she was overreacting. But each morning, the entries greeted her like a trusted advocate. See here, they seemed to say, this is real and measurable. Then came the day when documentation shifted from private solace to public offense. Rollins had trotted out 3 dress shirts with alleged defects before visiting Dallas clients. He'd done it with flourish. Miss Holloway, please explain how these passed your inspection. The entire factory floor fell silent as she stood beside him, heart pounding. Ruthie reached into her purse, withdrew a single sheet of notebook paper with a photograph pinned to it, and recited from memory. These shirts use purple thread markers. On September 15th, my department switched to blue markers by your own directive. These pieces are either from another line or another time. She held up the photo, an image she'd snapped on her lunch break of the old purple threads, time-stamped and labelled in her notebook. In that charged moment, the power of her records turned confusion into clarity. Rollins's smirk vanished, and the Dallas representatives nodded impressed. It was the first time evidence had protected her in plain sight. Encouraged, Ruthie formalized her documentation process. She created a simple template on her kitchen wall, date and time, incident description, involved parties and witnesses, relevant documents or photos, business impact, next steps or follow-up. Each evening, she dutifully filled in the template. She used the business impact line to translate personal slights into company metrics. A missing maintenance request became machine downtime, 4 hours, estimated loss $120. A delayed memo shifted from annoyance to production targets, missed 150 units. By framing events in terms of dollars hours and client satisfaction, she aligned her personal battle with the company's bottom line. A few weeks later, with the notebook brimming with cases, she drafted a concise report to present to Mr. Hargrove, the factory director. It began with an executive summary. Over the past 3 months, Department 5 has experienced 5 documented incidents of information suppression, 3 cases of resource misallocation, and 2 client quality challenges directly tied to unauthorized schedule changes. Total estimated cost, £2, £450. Behind the summary were clearly tabulated entries, culled from her spiral notebook, each linked to supporting memos, maintenance logs, or handwritten witness statements she'd collected. She stapled it all together and tucked copies into her purse, just in case her office drawer was searched. The day of the meeting arrived like a storm front. Hargrove's office was as austere as ever, wood panel walls, a solitary window, and a desk stacked with files. Rollins sat to one side, feigning casual interest. Ruthie laid her folder on the desk with calm precision, smoothing each page before Mr. Hargrove. As she spoke, she didn't raise her voice or brandish the evidence. She simply guided him through the report slide by slide. Each incident a stepping stone, each tab a testament. When she finished, there was a long silence. Hargrove, who'd always viewed her promotion as a corporate checkbox, leaned forward. He looked at Rollins, then back at the stack of documentation. "I'll need to review this fully," he said quietly. Rollins opened his mouth, but no words came. That afternoon, Hargrove's secretary called Ruthie to his office. When she arrived, the papers were gone, replaced by a single note. "Your documentation is compelling, effective immediately. Mr. Rollins is reassigned. Your performance review has been revised to reflect outstanding leadership. Interview candidates for assistant production manager next week." Ruthie exhaled a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Her notebook, once a repository for frustration, had become her shield and sword. It had taken her from isolation to vindication. The power of organized record-keeping lies in its neutrality. Facts, when laid out without emotion, demand a response. In Ruthie's case, the evidence could not be dismissed as grievance or hysteria. It was a clear trail of systematic interference, complete with dates, names, and dollar impacts. It turned hearsay into proof and rumors into accountability. Of course, documentation alone isn't a magic wand. It requires discipline to maintain, courage to present, and strategy to frame. Ruthie had 3 guiding principles. Consistency record, every incident large or small before memory fades. Context link, each note to business outcomes, time lost, money at stake. Client relations, confidentiality store copies away from prying eyes. Her home canister of old flower cans became a makeshift safe. Modern employees can adapt these principles, digitally encrypted journals, time-stamped screenshots, and backup drives kept off-site. But the heart of the strategy remains the same: build an unassailable case that transforms personal affronts into corporate concerns. By the end of 1974, Ruthie's spiral notebook had grown into a 3-ring binder bulging with evidence. She'd transitioned from reactive jotter to proactive strategist. No longer did she feel buffeted by Rollins's whims. She felt anchored by her own records. Each page was a brick in a foundation far stronger than intimidation or prejudice. As she closed that spiral notebook for the final time before transferring contents to a sturdier binder, she felt a shift within herself. The act of documenting had transformed her. What began as a shield against cruelty evolved into a bridge to opportunity. Thanks to that careful record-keeping, she not only survived her battle with Rollins, but emerged as the obvious candidate for further promotion. The next chapter of Ruthie Mae Holloway's journey would take her from vindication to legacy, scaling those lessons of documentation and solidarity into structural reforms that reshaped not only Heartland Textiles, but inspired women across America. But for now, beneath the gentle glow of her kitchen lamp, she allowed herself a moment of quiet triumph, knowing full well that facts, when faithfully recorded, carry a power no oppressor can erase. In the coming days, we'll explore how Ruthie leveraged her new position to build a lasting culture of accountability and inclusion, and how you too can turn documentation into a catalyst for broader change. By the time spring rolled around in 1976, the changes Ruthie Mae Holloway had set in motion at Heartland Textiles were rippling through the plant like new shoots pushing up through thawing soil. No longer was her department an isolated outpost battling invisible sabotage. It was a beacon of possibility. The very metrics that had once been twisted against her now told a story of collective success, one that even the most stubborn critics could no longer ignore. When she stepped onto the factory floor each morning, the humming machines and fabric-dusted air felt different. Production targets were not just met, they were exceeded. Reject rates, once inflated by manufactured quality issues, had dropped by nearly 12% compared to the previous year. Worker retention in her department climbed by 30% as absenteeism fell and morale rose. These weren't abstract numbers on a spreadsheet. They were real smiles on Doreen's face when she came in early to finish a batch. Real pride in Martha's careful stitches, real relief in the eyes of the billing clerks, whose invoices now matched actual shipments. Those before and after figures mattered because they showed that an inclusive, accountable environment could outperform the old guard. Corporate in Chicago took notice. In newsletters sent to every plant director, they highlighted Heartland's upward trajectory, calling it a model for the Midwest, and spotlighting the quiet leadership of Ruthie Holloway. The memo emphasized 3 key improvements: a 17% overall productivity boost, a 12% decline in defective goods, and a 33% reduction in turnover. These numbers became talking points at annual meetings not as corporate PR fluff, but as proof that fairness and performance walk hand in hand. Yet the most rewarding moments for Ruthie were not the charts or the memos, but the faces of the women she'd mentored. Doreen, once the shy seamstress who stayed late so her team could meet quota, had been promoted to department supervisor. With Ruthie's support, Doreen introduced flexible break schedules that honored family obligations without sacrificing output. She learned to speak up in management meetings backed by Ruthie's quiet nods and occasional interjections. Let's hear Doreen's view on staffing projections. Under Doreen's guidance, her new team saw another 8% rise in on-time deliveries. Then there was Emma Rodriguez, a Latina cutter, whose precision work had caught Ruthie's eye during a factory audit. When Emma confessed she'd never considered leadership, because women like me don't get those jobs, Ruthie showed her the spiral notebooks and binder, where every action, every success, every challenge had been documented. Emma surprised herself by applying for the open assistant supervisor position in early 1977 and landing it. She brought fresh ideas for process automation and led training sessions on new sewing technologies. By that summer, Emma's section was piloting a lean manufacturing initiative that trimmed 6 minutes off each garment cycle time. These protégés were more than individual success stories. They embodied Ruthie's philosophy that leadership thrives on mentorship documentation and collective courage. Each time a woman from the floor rose into management, it chipped away at the stony belief that only men could run the plant. By 1982, nearly 40% of supervisory roles at Heartland were held by women, and not because of any quota, but because these women had proven their worth in production numbers and in the tight bonds they'd forged with their teams. Bolstered by this momentum, Ruthie and the new plant director, Catherine Michaels, launched structural reforms that would ripple beyond the factory gates. They introduced an equal pay scale. Every supervisor's salary was tied to objective performance metrics: output, quality, client satisfaction, and team retention, rather than gender or tenure. Next, they established clear career paths, a published ladder of roles, and required competencies from line worker to director, so that anyone could see exactly what they needed to learn to advance. Perhaps most revolutionary for the early 1980s was the on-site daycare center, a converted office suite furnished with cribs, play mats, and a trained caregiver, allowing young parents to stay close to their children without losing precious work hours. These initiatives bore fruit quickly. Turnover plant-wide dropped by 25%, saving the company an estimated $150,000 annually in recruitment and training costs. Customer complaints fell by 18% as quality improved and consistency became the norm. More importantly, employee engagement surveys introduced as part of the new management toolkit showed a 42% uptick in workers reporting they felt valued and heard. It was proof that systemic change grounded in fairness and clear policy could transform both culture and bottom line. Heartland's success story soon caught the eye of other manufacturers. By 1985, a handful of Midwestern plants had visited to tour the Kansas facility, taking notes on the daycare setup and the transparent promotion ladder. A notable parallel emerged when in 2010, a family-owned furniture maker in North Carolina implemented similar daycare pods and objective pay scales and reported a 20% boost in productivity within a year. The through line from Ruthie's Kansas farm to that Carolina workshop was clear inclusion and accountability, when baked into policy, can outpace any short-lived cost-cutting measure. For viewers today, whether you're in a tech startup, a hospital administration, or a shift at a distribution warehouse, Ruthie's journey offers a roadmap. It's not enough to lean into individual resilience Organizations must build structures that reward fairness and transparency. To that end, here's a concise toolkit inspired by Ruthie's legacy. Document with purpose. Keep a shared or personal log of incidents, wins, and process changes. Tie each entry to business impact time. Save dollars earned, issues avoided. Use clear templates so any new leader can follow the thread. Create clear paths. Publish a visible career ladder with competencies for each role. Host quarterly how to advance workshops with cross-department mentors. Offer internal job fairs where employees can explore new functions. Standardize fair compensation. Link pay to measurable outcomes, not subjective seniority or gender. Conduct annual pay audits to identify and correct disparities. Transparently share benchmarking data so everyone understands the criteria. Foster inclusive sponsorship. Train managers to become sponsors who actively put protégés forward. Establish peer-to-peer mentorship circles that cross identity lines. Recognize sponsors publicly to encourage more to step up. Invest in well-being infrastructure, on-site or partnered childcare solutions to support working parents. Flexible scheduling policies that respect life outside work. Regular pulse surveys to gauge employee sentiment and act on feedback. Implementing these steps in your organization doesn't require massive budgets, just steady commitment. Like Ruthie's spiral notebook, the power lies in consistency and clarity. Start small, pilot a mentorship circle, draft a simple career roadmap, collect 1 month of attendance and performance data. Then iterate, listen, and expand. As you consider these tools, remember the heart of Ruthie's story. She began as a 19-year-old farm girl who refused to be sidelined. With mentorship, meticulous documentation, and unwavering solidarity, she not only reclaimed her dignity, but reshaped an entire factory culture and inspired countless women beyond its walls. Today, as the sun sets over grain fields or city skylines, every employee, every manager, and every CEO faces a choice: maintain the status quo or plant seeds of change. If you choose the latter, you may find that your legacy, like Ruthie's, blooms in ways you never imagined cultivating. Leaders, uplifting teams, and redefining what success truly looks like. The story doesn't end here. Wherever there's a workplace buzzing with possibility and prejudice lurking in the corners, there's room for another Ruthie Mae Holloway to stand up, speak truth, and build a more inclusive tomorrow.